We now move to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Later today I will be visiting Irvine to welcome plans by the pharmaceutical manufacturer GlaxoSmithKline to invest £100 million and create 100 new jobs across its Scottish operations in Irvine and Montrose. Now, this major investment reinforces Scotland's global reputation in life sciences. I also welcome the fact yesterday the Chancellor responded to John Swinney's proposal of the 7th of February that Irvine, along with Dundee and Nigg, be granted enhanced capital allowances as part of their status as enterprise areas. I am sure we all remember the Chancellor generously acknowledging that that was a John Swinney proposal when he made his budget statement yesterday. However, I welcome the developments, as indeed the Chamber does. I look forward to announcing further investment in these areas in coming months. I will be visiting Nigg tomorrow.
Joanne Lamont.
And I am sure you will enjoy your visit. And we always welcome this side glimmers of hope in terms of employment and investment in the interests of communities across Scotland. Presiding Officer, very few of us would agree with the approach taken by the Tories when it comes to our health service. So I was glad last month when the First Minister told us that Scotland is choosing a different path. Since then, we have found out a little more about the path taken by the First Minister, and it seems to have been a bit of a downhill gradient. Fewer nurses, decreasing standards in elderly care, cuts to social care budgets and patients going without blankets. And even the good statistics, as we found out yesterday, cannot be trusted. Before he rhymes off the stats he is no doubt already prepared, can I ask, why should we trust them?
First Minister.
Well, I think we should look at the record, particularly the public satisfaction with the health service in Scotland, which is at a record level, because the ultimate verdict in these matters is passed by the people and their confidence in their national health service, and that is in direct contrast to what is happening south of the border at the present moment, where many people are wondering whether they are going to have a national health service worthy of the name. So this government, this Health Secretary, this First Minister is totally committed to a national health service in Scotland.
Joanne Lamont.
I think the point of the Scottish Parliament is that we can all aspire to better than what the Tories are offering us at Westminster. But we do expect your record to be better too, and I will come to the people in a moment. Can we look first of all at what experts have been saying over the last few weeks? The Royal College of Nursing says there are not enough nurses to provide, quote, basic safe care. Audit Scotland is warning that councils and health boards are failing to ensure vital care services can be delivered in the future. The Centre for Public Policy in the Regions says that since 2006, Scotland has been lagging behind the increase in resources for England. Does the First Minister think they are all wrong as well?
First Minister.
Well, let's look at qualified nurses and midwives, and of course there are now more qualified nurses and midwives in Scotland than there were in 2006. But let's look at it in comparison with the other countries in these islands. Per head of population in Scotland, per head of 1,000 population, we have 8 nurses and midwives, compared to 5.9 in England, 7.3 in Wales and 7.6 in Northern Ireland. I think that indicates the huge priority that this government, that this Parliament invests in our national health service in Scotland. Now, Joanne Lamont says, there's not much comparison comparing what we are doing in Scotland as a united Parliament, I hope, in terms of preserving a national health service and what's happening in England. But of course we could look at what's happening in Wales at the present moment, the sole area on these islands where the Labour Party is in government. Now, let me just paraphrase this by saying I have got great sympathy for the Welsh Government and the pressure they are under in terms of the Westminster Government. We are under exactly the same pressure. Yeah. But the Welsh Government decided not to protect the revenue budget of the National Health Service in real terms. It's due to fall by 8% in real terms between 2011 and 2014, unlike the decision made by this administration to protect the revenue budget of the National Health Service in real terms. So the contrast is not just between Scotland and the SNP and the Tories in Westminster. The contrast is between the SNP in Scotland and Labour in Wales. And I think the vast majority of people in Scotland will support the policy of this government to protect our National Health Service.
First of all, your budget has been cut in real terms by £319 million. Secondly, the substance of that answer was the RCN, the Nurses Union, is wrong. And to talk about Wales, we would like him to focus on his responsibilities as First Minister here. Because he talks about, on these benches, we would love very much to be in his position, I can assure you. Once again, for this government, the rhetoric doesn't fit with reality. So the First Minister doesn't accept the picture painted by the experts. What's he got to say to Helen Macbeth? Mrs Macbeth is 92 years old and was very seriously ill in the Royal Alexandra Hospital in Paisley. She spent her first night frozen because embarrassed staff were unable to get her a blanket. She had to rely on her daughter bringing one in for her the next day. Or Jack Barr, a great-grandfather who went into the RAH for a serious operation. 3 nights in hospital with only his beach towel to keep him warm. Does the First Minister realise it's not enough just to say you're protecting the NHS, you actually have to do it?
First Minister.
The Health Secretary has indicated that she is prepared to look into any case in the National Health Service where care doesn't meet the standards we expect. But this is a huge priority for this government and for this Parliament. And I think there should be just a care from Jan Lamont. I mean, Jackie Bailey's already had to partially apologise, I think would be the words, about her scare story on shortage of blankets in the Greater Glasgow Health Board, which turned out to be totally untrue, as she's very, very well aware. But I know that the survey, which wasn't a Scottish survey incidentally, which was published this week, indicated concern with nurses across the UK. There was no Scottish sample in the survey. However, there has been surveys by the RCN which were a Scottish sample. For example, there was one in April 2006 where 4,000 nurses were questioned in Scotland. And in that survey in 2006, in April, where Joanne Lamont was a government minister, if I remember, 2/3 of nurses said their workload prevented them providing a standard of care that they wanted. The current survey, across the September 11 survey, that had declined to 50% who were concerned. Now, I would like to have a situation where in a survey that no nurse was concerned about the pressure of work. But by any standards, that represents a substantial improvement to when Labour were in office, to when the SNP were in office. And let's remember that Labour were in office when, due to their incompetence in financial management, they couldn't even spend the Scottish budget was allocated. We've been protecting the National Health Service against the most ferocious cuts for many generations. That's why we stand proudly on our record on Scotland's National Health Service.
It's one thing for the First Minister to repeat his version of his record. He has to confront the reality of what's happening in people's lives. It's also one thing to attack Jackie Bailey. It's something entirely different to attack those who are raising concerns about the National Health Service. Because we've established that the First Minister won't listen to me. We've established he won't listen to independent voices. Will he listen to people suffering from his mismanagement of the NHS? Mrs Macbeth and Mr Barr are sitting right there, in the public gallery. We've found at least 7 recent cases of patients going without blankets at the Royal Alexandra Hospital, and we pointed this out. The government denied it. George Adam, the MSP for Paisley, called on me to investigate my own health spokesperson, Jackie Bailey, for having the audacity to give voice to the complaints of her own constituents. And the reality is, if Mr Adam had just shelled out 45 pence for his local newspaper, the Paisley Daily Express, he would have seen our claims are true. And if the First Minister won't believe me, why doesn't he come and meet with Mr Barr and Mrs Macbeth in my office after this session and explain that we don't have a problem with the NHS? It's a figment of Jackie Bailey's imagination, because they'll tell him, as I am telling him, what the NHS is really like under the SNP. When is the First Minister going to stop the rhetoric and face up to the reality of his own responsibilities?
First Minister.
I refer Joanne Lamont to my last question.
Order, First Minister.
I said specifically that this Health Secretary, that Nicola Sturgeon, would investigate any case in the National Health Service where treatment fell below expectations, and will be delighted to meet the patients concerned or any other people who experience care which is less than what all of us would expect. That's what I said in my last answer. Nor did I criticise the nurses of Scotland. On the contrary, I pointed out that we would look to have a situation where nurses weren't concerned about numbers and standards of care. I merely pointed out that surveys show the standard of care, according to the nurses, is an improving situation from when Labour were in power. But we shouldn't be surprised about that, should we? Because let's remember in 2007, when this government came to office, the government then, which Joanne Lamont was a member of, said that the National Health Service would just have to cut its cloth. It wouldn't get any consequentials whatsoever. That was the policy of Jack McConnell. During the recent election campaign, Ian Gray, and he's sitting there, said in Newsnight Scotland on 8 September, we wouldn't ring-fence the health budget in Scotland. So the reality is, thanks to the election of this government in 2007, the NHS had more money spent in it. Thanks to the re-election of this government last year, the NHS has more money spent in it. Given what's happening in Wales, nobody can be in any doubt that the only party in Scotland committed to protecting the National Health Service and its real terms budget is this SNP government.
Joanne Lamont.
Whatever that was, it wasn't taking responsibility. Can I just point out to the First Minister, his Health Secretary wrote and said the problem with the towels, where they were there, the staff couldn't source them. He said it was an isolated incident. Unison members, as was reported in the Evening Times, have been complaining for 10 months that this was a serious issue. It's about time the Minister took responsibility, recognised he has the power and defend the NHS and respond to the concerns of constituents.
First Minister.
I think, as Joanne Lamont well knows, that the Health Board explicitly denied that Jackie Bailey's claims as far as the recycled towels were concerned, and I don't think it's a very useful idea to return to something which our health spokesman should be genuinely embarrassed about. I've got great interest in making sure, as Nicola Sturgeon does, that every patient who experiences less than satisfactory care is not just met, but also these issues and complaints are dealt with. But I'm merely pointing out that it's beyond argument that if Labour had come to power in 2007 and continued in office, if they'd come to power last year, there'd be less resources spent on Scotland's National Health Service. The fact that Joanne Lamont was in government in 2007 and deputy leader last year indicates that she should hang her head in shame, that she was prepared to under-resource Scotland's National Health Service.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he'll next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
I have no plans in the near future, but I think Ruth Davidson has an appointment with the Prime Minister in the very near future.
Ruth Davidson.
Indeed. To ask the First Minister how much money has been diverted within the health budget in Scotland to fund free prescriptions for people like him, who are perfectly willing and able to pay.
First Minister.
Well, I'm not surprised in the slightest that Ruth Davidson doesn't want to talk about yesterday's budget, and particularly the effect on old people across Scotland. But let's remember the huge number of people, hundreds of thousands of people earning under £16,000 who were having to pay prescriptions in Scotland before they were rightfully abolished by this government. And I can tell Ruth Davidson that the idea that you should cut taxes for the richest members of the community at the expense of not providing medicines that people can afford, it will be deeply unpopular in Scotland. Yes. But deep unpopularity is nothing new for the Scottish Conservative Party.
Ruth Davidson.
I'm happy to talk about the 73,000 people taken out of tax altogether, the 2.1 million people who see their tax rate rise, the biggest rise in pensions which will benefit pensioners right across the country. But that's not the numbers I asked from this First Minister, and I'll give him the numbers that I asked for. The government's own figure is that £130 million will be spent funding free prescriptions by the end of this month alone. That's £130 million to buy votes at the last election. But as we heard last week, there's no money for a cancer drug fund. £130 million for prescriptions, but the RCN tells us this week less money for nurses in the front lines, and despite the protestations from the First Minister today, the lowest number of nurses in Scotland for 6 years. A £130 million bill for free prescriptions, and yesterday a health board found fiddling the figures because it's missing its targets, and today the British Medical Association saying that even visiting your family doctor means getting treated in substandard conditions and in crumbling buildings. Government is all about choices. Will the First Minister now admit that there are far graver needs in Scotland's health service than his choice for a free prescription giveaway?
First Minister.
Well, I think pressure on the National Health Service and other budgets in Scotland might be something to do with the cutbacks taking place from the Westminster Government. I'm surprised even Ruth Davidson would want to defend the situation testified by pharmacists across the country where patients had to choose which medicines they took because of prescription charges and the impost on people with repeat and regular prescriptions. But I don't think mentioning the British Medical Association is a particularly good idea for Ruth Davidson. As I understand it, they are thinking of standing candidates against the Conservative Party in England, so disgusted are they by the performance of the Tory government on the health service. But I am delighted that Ruth Davidson wants to talk about yesterday's budget, because David Mundell on television last night was unable to tell us how many people in Scotland would benefit from the cut in top rate tax, and unable to tell us how many pensioners would suffer from the pensioners being punished in the budget. Well, I can tell Ruth Davidson 15,000 top taxpayers in Scotland will benefit, and 327,000 current pensioners and 500,000 future pensioners will be punished by the Tory Liberal Democrat coalition. I actually believe, incidentally, that these 15,000 top-rate taxpayers in Scotland would not have wanted their bonus to be at the expense of 500,000 pensioners in Scotland. And therein lies the difference between the politics of the SNP and the politics of Scotland and the politics of the Conservative Party. Punish the pensioners and keep the rich happy is the policy of the Tory Party. Devoted to all of the people of Scotland is the policy of this government.